Okay, so we are going to start chapters 21 and 22, which mainly take us through the 1960s. There is a ton of historical information that is still relevant today that takes place in the 60s and a lot of crazy events. So let's get started. Let's first talk about the election of 1960. Remember, President Eisenhower was the Republican president that had lasted from 1953 through 1961 is when his term will be done. Because remember, presidents cannot run for more than 2 terms anymore. That was the Franklin Roosevelt rule. And Eisenhower is going to be done. The economy was going so well, and things were, for the most part, minus the Cold War, things were relatively stable in America. People had jobs, people had possessions, material possessions, and so the thought was that the Republicans were actually probably going to win. And so Eisenhower is, for the most part, going to be just, leaving office as a president that wouldn't be ranked as like a top 10, but he'd be middle of the road because, for the most part, the Korean War ended under him. And like I said, we had a lot of material goods, people had jobs, and things were going relatively well, minus the Cold War scares that we were dealing with. The candidates in the election of 1960, John F. Kennedy, and you guys obviously have heard of him. This is a picture of him when he was in the Navy and a younger picture of him. So he did have some military experience. And, candidates nowadays don't really necessarily always have a ton of military experience, but back then it was a pretty common thing. And he was from the Democratic Party and had been involved in politics for a little bit. But one of the things that he brought to the table that was interesting for a lot of people was the fact that he was Catholic. Now, he would not be the first Catholic candidate we've had, but he would have been and will be the first Catholic president we had. You have to understand that as we've talked through our history, we said that a lot of times people did not like Catholicism as it was associated with Eastern Europe and a lot of their religions. And so people were a little bit nervous. People would rather have a Protestant president, meaning like a Lutheran or a Methodist or a Baptist or a Presbyterian, and he was openly Catholic. And a lot of people did not like that in America. They were not comfortable with it. They associated it with the Irish. They associated it with, not with the main religions of America. He was young, and kind of brought a little bit more energy than what some of the other candidates had. You got to think of, Eisenhower was a little bit older. He's a much different step than Eisenhower would be. He came from a wealthy family. He was handsome and he was smart. And again, when you're looking at political candidates, being handsome does start to become a factor. Why? Because of television. And that became a really big deal for people to have a president that looked like a president. Because for the most part, up until this point in time, people never really saw the president except for in pictures or in the newspapers. And again, this is a picture of him. This is when he was in the White House. So you do kind of see he just looks like a younger president, had a lot more energy as a president, and just had a fervor about him, something about him, an infectious personality that people really, really liked, and were pretty excited about it. His rival that he's going to be going against is Richard Nixon. Now, Richard Nixon, here's a picture of him. And so, girls, you'd have to tell me who you think was more attractive. I'm not going to go down that road. But Richard Nixon is going to be the Republican candidate. Now, we've already heard about Nixon, and mainly because he was involved in his fight against communism. In fighting in the 1950s, he was the guy that was going after Alger Hiss and was very openly against communism. And so he kind of made a name for himself, but he also made a name for himself because he was the vice president of Eisenhower. And a lot of times, if the president that was the previous president was doing very well, like Eisenhower was doing, and his vice presidential candidate was up for nomination to become president next, a lot of people would actually end up voting for him just to kind of keep everything moving as smoothly as possible. And it was actually kind of rare for a president that was doing well, like Eisenhower, and his vice president to kind of lose out on that next election. And so he did have a lot of political experience. He was very, very qualified to be president. And so he's going to run against Kennedy. Again, a little bit older than Kennedy. And Kennedy was kind of like a mastermind of kind of communicating to people. Richard Nixon wasn't really like that. He wasn't super charismatic when it came to that type of personality. He just didn't have that. And probably the biggest thing that this election came down to was the TV debates. Now, as we've talked about TV in the last chapter, by the end of the 1950s, most American homes had a television in it. So they, used to have presidential debates. It wasn't too uncommon, and it was actually done on the radio, so people would just listen to it, or they would publish it in the newspapers, which would be a little bit long and drawn out. But for the most part, people would just listen to debates on the radio. But the television debates kind of looked something like this. Not too much different than what we have today. The two candidates would get up there and they would talk and they would explain what their policies are and what they want to try to accomplish. And the TV debate was pretty something kind of relatively new. And the bottom line in this television debate, this was the first presidential television debate, so make sure you understand that it's the first one that we've ever had. Kennedy just looked better on TV. He actually did some research. He figured out what the background was going to look like as far as in behind him, and he wore suits that would offset that. Meaning, if it was a light background, he'd wear a dark suit. If it was a dark background, he would wear a light suit to kind of make himself look different and stand out. He watched how public speakers acted, how actors did stuff on TV that kind of would make people want to watch them. And he just studied that. And the bottom line is Kennedy just looked better on TV. This was one of the reasons why. I'll show you a picture here. This is one of their debates. And if you notice, there's a light background behind Kennedy and a dark suit that Kennedy's in. And in this debate, Nixon has the same, almost the exact same color background. And so on a black and white TV, this picture doesn't really do it justice, but on a black and white TV, Nixon really looked kind of flushed out. He didn't really look that great. And if you notice, he's wiping his face. He had actually been sick for some of these debates, but the other thing that really worked against him, he tended to sweat a lot. You guys probably know those type of people. Parker seems like that type of kid. Hopefully you're watching this, Parker. And but he would sweat, and as he would sweat, he would have to dab the sweat off of his face. Not the dab like you guys know, the actual dance, but he would take the handkerchief and he would kind of, pat his face to get the sweat so it wouldn't beat up on him. And on top of that, they would put makeup on it, so his makeup would start to run. And when somebody's doing that, when you have somebody that's publicly speaking and is wiping their face, the sweat off of their face, what would you think that people watching this would think? They would think that they're nervous. And Kennedy just seemed nervous on TV. He was kind of standing funny. He did have a knee injury as well. I'm going to show you a video on that in just a second. But he just seemed more nervous. He just didn't seem like he was very comfortable up there. And when you're watching somebody on TV, sometimes their body language overrides what you're hearing them say. And so even though his content might be good, his body language really looks bad. You guys will probably learn more about that when you guys take speech classes. This is another debate that they had. They had several debates, and again, notice how he's wiping his face. Now, a lot of times he would wait till the camera was, kind of off of him, but sometimes the camera would show both angles, and he would do that, and as soon as he got done, he would kind of have dry mouth. He'd also take a lot of drinks of water, but he would kind of wipe the sweat off of his face to try to make himself not look as nervous and sweaty, but it probably made it worse. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a video on this. So let me kind of exit out of this and go to this thing here, and here we go.
At 43, JFK is one of the youngest men to ever run for president. His hip approach to campaigning injects a new energy to politics.
I come to the Bronx as an old Bronx boy. I used to live in the Bronx.
The handsome young senator has a lot to overcome. But the Kennedy campaign has a plan to sell him to the country. Now, 90% of U.S. households own a television.
Good evening. The television stations of the United States are proud to provide facilities for a discussion of issues by the two major candidates for the presidency. The candidates
On September 26, 1960, 70 million people tune in to America's first televised presidential debate.
I'm not satisfied until every American enjoys his full constitutional rights
JFK is prepped for his television appearance. The day before, he met with producers and discussed camera angles. He looks tanned and glowing.
I don't want the talents of any American to go to waste.
He is wearing a blue suit and shirt to reduce glare and stand out against the gray backdrop.
Smith, Senator Kennedy, there is no
Nixon
question
looks exhausted.
but that this nation
He's straight from the
cannot
campaign trail and is recovering from the flu. He also has a knee injury, making him appear uncomfortable and shifty.
I wonder if you can explain that. There is no question but that we cannot discuss our internal affairs in the United States without recognizing that they have a tremendous bearing on our international position. Mr. Vice President,
His gray suit and pale face appear to blend into the set.
Campaign issue. I'd like to follow Mr.
The visual contrast between the men
Now the
damages
candidates will
Nixon.
answer questions or comment upon one another's answers to questions.
Viewers think Kennedy has the edge, even though radio listeners have the opposite impression. During the debate, Kennedy's on-camera performance makes him look like a leader. And old doubts about his youth are forgotten. Studies will later show that this debate made up the minds of 4 million voters. 3 million vote for Kennedy.
Okay, so let's go back to this. And as we said that Nixon seemed nervous on TV, this really did change the way presidents were seen. And moving forward, what's going to take place is presidents are going to have to worry about their public image on TV. Now, if you noticed in that thing, everything was done in color. Most people in America did not have color TVs, so that's why the color contrasts were a big deal as far as Nixon wearing the gray suit with the gray background. And it kind of looked more like this is kind of what it would have looked like. And this is even almost too clear of a picture as well. But Nixon just didn't seem well and to do well on TV. So keep this in mind that Kennedy wins this election probably based on this television debate. It was a super, super close election. And most historians believe that as a result of this television debate, Kennedy wins, Nixon loses. Now, Nixon is going to run for president again, and he will eventually be our president. But this probably changed history. Well, actually, it did change history in the fact that Kennedy does take over, and we start to talk about President Kennedy as a president who had a lot of big ideas but was not able to accomplish them based on his assassination. So we'll stop here for today. Hope you guys have a great afternoon.